but coming in the journal of unusual principles.
So,
So,
Diego, I'm really pleased you're here, but I don't know much about you. So, if
Alright.
you can present yourself.
I can give a little bit of an introduction. So, my name is Diego Caleiro. I'm a biological anthropologist in training and a philosopher by formation. I've studied psychology, philosophy, and biological anthropology, and my main lines of interest are within different fields of knowledge, the things that are most connected to minds or to evolution. And I've also participated in the creation of the effective altruism movement in its early conception. And I'm a nomadic traveler in Europe as of right now, in Bulgaria.
Super cool.
So that's basically my story and how I got here.
Yeah, that's super cool. When I met you online, I was really fascinated how you could connect all of these different disciplines and all of this through the prism of evolutionary psychology. And what I really liked about you is that you can actually solve current social problems, so propose possible solutions which are based on evolutionary psychological thinking. And in that sense, evolutionary psychology can be used as a predictive theory. Find
Right.
possible solutions. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I mean, to a great extent, there's a combination of ignorance and a little bit of suppression in terms of how we deal with evolutionary psychology, because we just don't. Most people don't have a complete model of how our cognition was sculpted by evolution, and because they do not have that, there's a lot of political solutions or social solutions or sociology solutions that basically slip through your fingers, right? People throw the baby with the bathwater because they assume things about human nature that are not necessarily true. So I think you actually need to have a lens that uses evolutionary science and evolutionary psychology in order to even begin to understand how to tackle any particular problem that you're dealing with. And yeah. So
Yeah, and except for evolutionary psychology, do you happen to know any other theory which comes close in
Well-
explaining human behavior in a predictive way?
I mean, to the extent that if you mean that comes close in ability to talk to particular people and how to organize your life around it, I don't think so. I think evolutionary psychology is the most pragmatically useful science that I'm aware of. You can get good insight from philosophy, from evolution, from anthropology and other things, but it really helps in navigating the human social space and world, especially when it comes to things like courtship and society design, which are two things that humans are essentially and forever very interested and curious about. Right? People always want to change their society, and people always want to find a mate and and be with them. So
And how society design changes through the years. I mean, is the change in certain societies exponentially growing in speed, like how often it changes? Or is there a pattern or something like that?
well, one of the biggest prediction factors that you can take from evolutionary anthropology to think about that is technology has connected people who are at farther and farther distances over time. So it means that we are dealing with minds that have evolved in systems and organizations that are like less and less like our own. So one thing that a lot of people have been studying recently is pathological altruism, which is the case where like altruism sort of backfires, that is your generosity or your kindness towards strangers backfires, because the reason why you evolved to be altruistic to begin with is because the people nearby you have evolved in a system of high trust, or because they share genes with you, or a combination thereof, right? But then when you manifest the same level of altruism and understanding and empathy and so on towards people who are farther away, it doesn't necessarily reflect the good that could come out of that originally. So that's one example where the exponential technological development generated a geographical crushing of boundaries, and then the psychological adaptation you had, which was very useful for your biogeography, no longer functions.
That's remind me for the migration people especially in Europe. Right
Yeah.
now there is migration crisis.
Yeah.
So maybe there we have something like that. That's the clash of cultural difference.
And one thing I notice a lot in the Europeans that I talk to, even in this trip, right, especially people who aren't, in science or particularly interested in these topics, is precisely that, right, where I get much more predictive information about what a person will think about immigration, about people who are coming in, from knowing where they are from and where they evolved and what their society is like, than I get from the information about like who are the people coming in or something like that, right? So like my Swiss friend, Switzerland being a very high trust, high, high level of trust society and a very like organized old society. He basically trusts everyone who to come, and all of his perspectives are kind of infused with this idea that everyone is trustworthy, that there is like an easy path to transforming a person of one kind and of one like system of organization into a person of a different kind, and he's not concerned about that at all. Same thing for Norway, right? But as you approach, I suppose, as you get closer and closer to the places from where people are immigrating, you get a more differentiated sense because different countries have these different levels of trust. I think Bulgaria, where we are, is one of the inverse trust countries, where people in common goods games, they are willing to pay to punish someone who actually cooperated with the common goods that will grow, which is kind of the reverse of what happens in Norway.
Was the evolutionary adaptation of that?
It's actually not well determined. So Sapolsky, who's a American biogenomic psychologist, a mix of behavioral genomist.
The zebra guy.
The zebra guy, also zebra guys. He basically says like we don't really know exactly what's going on there, but one can speculate, right? So like there's a transition from more clannish individualistic societies to more from our clannish family nepotistic societies to more individualistic institution-based societies. And that transition in Europe, it is very manifest, right? So there's a few regions in Europe, basically, that through influence of the Catholic Church, among other things, they evolved higher levels of individualism and higher levels of institutionalism. And then as you back away from that, you have societies where people don't like if you start creating a more individualistic, more institution-based system, which is how a high trust system works. Yeah, it's not very obvious why you would want to punish someone who is contributing to the common goods, except if you have a gift economy, for instance, and you expect that person isn't just providing the resource itself, but they're just trying to signal that they're better than you. So you're trying to like cut them from the ability of signaling, look, you can't pay back this, like I'm giving you a gift so good, you can't really pay back. And in some gift societies that does happen. There's also many African societies that do the same thing.
Regarding pathological altruism, let me wrap it up so that I know that I understood you. So your psychological systems for altruism evolved so when you help, you either expect help in return in the future, or you expect that when you help, you are helping at least partially some of your genes which are in another body, so to speak. And now when you help strangers or people who aren't genetically related to you, you aren't helping your genes, and maybe you can't get anything in return if they are like at the other end of the world, something like that.
That would be a more biological version of the concept of pathological altruism, but I don't think that that's how most people who are thinking about it in sociology think of it. So yeah, you can think of kin selection and the fact that, in our current societies, because there's diversity of populations, when you contribute to someone, they are less likely to share your genes, right? And that might be, in a sense, a problem. But what people mostly mean by pathological altruism is when you were considering being altruistic for evolutionary reasons because you evolved with other people who will also be altruistic, but now you're dealing with people who are more likely to cheat, or who are more likely. So it's it's not that much about whether they share genes with you or not. It's about whether they will manifest the same behavior when, like the problem, when the short stick is in your hand and the long stick is in their hand. Will they give it? Will they help you the same way you help them? And that's basically the reasoning behind the people who think about pathological altruism. So I would say it's a game theory concept more than it's a biology concept. Yeah.
Okay, makes sense. Can you think of or list some drawbacks of evolutionary psychology?
I mean, drawbacks of knowing it or drawbacks of the science having existed?
Actually, both when you're asking like that.
Okay. I mean, the science itself got a lot of hits, and it's really hard for an evolutionary psychologists to establish themselves in other departments. Because, if you go talk to the people in neuroscience or something like that, they'll be like, look, we don't want the social justice warriors and the people who will attack us to come attack us. So please, leave your field, which is too dramatic and too close to political chaos.
We don't want a podcast with you,
Right. So in part, evolutionary psychology was actually created. Well, okay, maybe not in the 70s when it was created, but in the last 10, 15 years, it's sort of a refuge, right? It's a refuge where it's so well known that the material that's going to come in there, it's not going to be that appreciated by the sociologists, by the anthropologists, and by the art critics and literary critics, that it's okay. But there needed to be this separate realm where those ideas can be studied, because if they are added to biology, if they're added to neuroscience, if they're added to other fields, especially in the United States, it gets really mad really fast, just because of the political contentions between different personalities and fields and people.
And regarding some weak points of evolutionary psychology as a theory, as a methodology, so.
Well, I mean, what kinds of mistakes we're most likely to make, or yeah.
For example, yes.
Yeah, I mean,
side effects.
Yeah, there's a lot of criticism that happens in many media. Like the way in which evolutionary psychology is depicted in many media is very problematic, because much like anything else, people go for whatever the most sensationalist version of a theory is. There's a very good evolutionary psychologist called David Smith, a professor, I don't remember where now, but he has an article, 10 or 8 big mistakes that people make when thinking about evolutionary psychology. And then you can use that as a filter, sort of, to organize how you read through when the media is talking about it. But one of the classic complaints is that it isn't predictive, or it doesn't make, it doesn't have an obvious experimental data, and it's a bunch of just so stories. And then he also has a reply article to that saying, look, here are the 8 different epistemological sources of information that evolutionary psychologists gather in order to generate their theories. It's not just so stories. Yeah, so there's a good defense of that.
Can be used evolutionary psychology to predict some of the future moves of, let's say, or behaviors of on macro level of countries or nationalities or something like that?
Well, you can anticipate what the clash between different populations will be if you put those populations together to some extent, right? So one thing that is true of all humans is that we trust people who are like us more than we trust people who are less like us. So this is actually one of the big things that's happening, in political contentions in many places now. You can use it to predict how these populations will interact.
Or maybe alliances, how may combine, let's say, or something.
Are you asking if it could be used to justify alliances between populations that are similar?
I mean more like, let's say I'm United States as a country,
right,
and I would like to have a trade alliance. Should I use evolutionary psychology for my decision making? Or with who should I be in alliance or something like that?
Well, I mean, we're talking about a very specific subset, so maybe I should mention that. Like, we're talking about a specific subset of evolutionary psychology,
Mhm.
which is the evolutionary psychology of populations in
Mm.
relation to other populations, whereas most of evolutionary psychology is just about things that we all share as humans, right? So, baby taking behavior of taking care of babies, nourishing behavior, mating, organizing yourself in specific ways in relation to the environment. But if you're talking about these specific differences, that's what's going to pop up, let's say, in political discussion, you can actually predict the types of governments that a population will have based off a combination of its biogeography
Mhm.
and the evolved characteristics of that population. So if you knew that, it will help you determine, for instance, if you should try to attack a population in the Middle East and change their government from a more authoritarian system to a less authoritarian system. Like, maybe not, because that population evolved in a scarcity environment, in deserts where honor cultures evolve, and where all those factors take place, you're not to expect to establish a Western educated democracy and so on.
Um, have you, I presume you know about cybernetics.
I know some about cybernetics. I've read some amount about it.
Yeah.
Uh,
So it's the science of steering biological entities and machines.
Right.
So many people think of cybernetics for like cyborgs or something like that, but
Right.
The cool stuff.
it's way before
Broader,
everything
yeah.
like robotics, and it's how you could let's say steer the decision of let's say group of people or even to an individual, or it could be even a mechanical entity, let's say an AI.
Right. Well, I mean, in engineering, there's control theory, which is fairly connected to cybernetics, and systems that are cybernetic have basically mechanisms that reorganize them and redirect them back into a specific direction. Um, Biological systems might have similar things, right? So if you increase the food supply in a determined region, you're going to get more reproduction, but up to a point where the resources and the reproduction are pattern matched again, and then you get a loss in population, right? So biological systems definitely do have cybernetic properties, but not necessarily you can use that kind of thing to reason about evolutionary psychology or more specifically like population dynamics and the competitive evolution of different populations. In fact, one of my advisors asked like this precise question. He was asking me about whether cybernetics is valuable or not in order to assess one of my papers, which is about the value of like thinking about Christianity as a superorganism and thinking about other religions as a superorganism. So to what extent are religions like a beehive, like an ant hill, like groups of insects that are a biological unit, even though they're a group. And he sort of contested my claim that it's possible that you can evaluate religions that way, that you can evaluate these groups that way, by saying, look, you can also think about these things cybernetically as continuous entities that are always mutually influencing each other. But evolution doesn't work like that, because evolution organizes itself around discrete units. So you need discrete units like the genes in order to get the cumulatory mutations that eventually constitute a big difference, right? So you can only create a difference if the differences from which you're composing your larger difference are also discrete units. So if you mean cybernetics as the science of the continuous interference between different systems on each other, then no, cybernetics can't be used to think about evolutionary psychology. But I don't know if that's what he meant. That's what this particular advisor meant when he asked me that question.
Yeah, and another thought is like, if let's say Christianity is a tool that is used by someone who implies cybernetics to control a group or entities. This is
Right.
like another approach, but maybe then we're getting more in Yeah.
Well, there's the question of whether the control is coming from the top, from the
Top
bottom,
down.
or from a combination thereof, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So I tend to lean on the direction that it's a combination thereof, and there are definitely emerging properties in religions and in cultures and in nations that make that group be sort of like a biological unit, in the same sense that a group of ants that lives in the same hill is a biological unit in a significant manner, and that's basically the thing that I'm examining right now. Me and a few other evolutionary anthropologists and biologists and so on, we're trying to basically dissolve a bit of something that I defended most of my life, but that was probably wrong, which is this new atheist perspective that religion is mostly a virus in the mind, instead of being a symbiont or a mutualist combination of cultural ideas and physical buildings and rituals and so on that actually helps you organize and structure a biological unit that evolves over time.
Yeah, and did it play a role in organizing the behavior of vastly different tribes? Yesterday we discussed the many psychological, cultural, and biological and immunological reasons why different groups hate each other. From our evolutionary past.
Right.
And did religion play a role in helping vastly different tribes work together?
Well, if you think about the evolution of monotheism, this actually happened at a very visible, symbolic level, right? So you had different tribes and different organizations, sometimes polytheist, sometimes beginning to be monotheist, but they all had different gods and different mythologies. What happened in the evolution of monotheism, and Joe Henrich is a Harvard professor that studies this, is as the society scaled, these gods were merged into each other in a somewhat cybernetic symbiotic process, and we eventually landed into a biological group that had this one god idea, right? So the Abrahamic religions, they are very effective at monitoring and organizing the behavior of a society in scale. It's you can get a society running if it's a small society with many gods. But once it gets sufficiently large, especially if you're in a desert area and you only have the sun as a natural feature, one god is a more effective way of organizing behavior and of preventing, misdemeanors, crimes, and other ways in which people could behave that are damaging to the group or damaging to themselves.
I should ask, how did this evolutionary psychological knowledge impact your life in practical terms?
Could I just ask a question before that, because we're going to go to another direction?
Yeah.
Having one entity, let's say a god, it's for your perspective, it's more efficient. Could we say that?
Well, yeah, it can organize a society that is larger in scale, right?
Yeah, and
people are more afraid if the god is more powerful as well.
And right now we have this even in it's like a technical problem. Even in let's say right now the cryptocurrency community face the same thing, and that is like if you have one entity to validate, let's say, transactions, it's really fast. If you have multiple entities to validate a transaction, it's slow. Everyone should validate. And we have the same problem in democracy. So...
Right. So basically what you're seeing there is the cost of scale.
Yeah.
Right? The thing all these things have in common is it's really costly to run a society of humans, it's costly to run a system of smart contracts, and it's costly to run there's a constant battle, let's say, between the centralizers and the decentralizers. So you can think of that as, the centralizers in when you think about politics and government, centralizers are usually like the more communist left-leaning side, and the decentralizers are more capitalistic and so on. In technology, the decentralizing systems are smart contracts, cryptocurrencies in general,
Peer
and
to
the more
peer.
centralizing you are, like the people who are dealing with artificial general intelligence
Yeah.
and AI, right? So China is very big on AI, so you see that the political and the technological are matching there, where both of those are centralizing systems. China is a very centralized government.
For me, the next
And in religion, it's monotheism and polytheism, I
yeah, and
suppose.
for me, the next revolution, the next evolution of humankind is going to achieve decentralized structure that is more efficient than centralized. And I haven't seen that.
So you mean in the social and economic realms?
Everything. I mean,
Because not necessarily there's an equivalent in biology there, right? So this is not going to happen to genes. This is happening to our monetary system or something like that.
I mean, yeah, but if we find it in one structure, even in technical terms, because let's say I'm doing a lot of programming, and if you have to validate data, it doesn't come even to cryptocurrency. In decentralization is quite older problem on how you spread data and validate data.
Right.
If we, let's say, in technical term, find a solution, we can apply that in societies. If, I think culture will change our self culture in large scale.
Well,
And
it could definitely change culture, and in general, in the last few years, right, ever since Brexit, our culture is already transitioning to a more decentralized nationalistic state, right? Like with Bitcoin and all the election of the nationalist presidents everywhere, and people leaning more right wing. It seems that social media and the internet have had a massive effect on increasing the power of individuals and families and tribal affiliation and nations, and decreasing the power of centralized media control and what people call like globalists or internationalist groups and systems that usually are the same personality types that organize and circumscribe like media sources in most places. Yeah, and that used to have a lot more control of governments, until a few years ago. So we're definitely seeing a movement towards decentralization in politics in the world, and it's mimicked in a way by the decentralization in cryptocurrencies and other smart contract systems.
do you think that this is in some way related? That in psychology terms, let's say in the 80s, more people started to believe that they are unique, and more like marketing was used to propose that you are a unique person, you are the individual, and so
Like
on.
a snowflake theory?
You
that's-
achieve everything, you believe in yourself.
Well, individualism is actually an enemy of centralization. To the extent that Christianity, in a sense, is an instantiator of individualism. The United States and the United States Constitution are instantiators of individualism. There are countries that are fairly individualistic, and that's sort of in the opposite direction, right? Individualism is the maximum level of decentralization you can possibly have. That said, making everyone believe they're a special snowflake and absolutely unique in some magical way, and that they are owed more than they deserve or something like that. That might be closer to something that is favorable to a more internationalist, globalist value system and agenda. But the reason is because then these people who believe that they are somehow deserving of more because of their particular way, they will start identifying with a particular group, and then by identifying with a group, you acquire all the grievances of the group, and second, you can try to use the state as the mediator in order for you to get the things that people made you believe you need. Right?
Yeah, that's where I was going with, let's say, propaganda, and how propaganda is integrated in the corporations, how corporations use the propaganda. And Edward Bernays is how it's
Bernays?
pronounced. Bernays.
I don't know.
Um, the nephew of Sigmund Freud. He uses he integrated propaganda in for corporate culture, for sales,
Right.
using and
And he lived for 104 years, you know.
and what I was trying to say, because he managed to use the propaganda in different times, how to say it, time spans where the psychology of humans was different. Let's say you have individualism, you have if you identify by class. So if you identify by class you sell for the luxury items for the rich guys and so on. You are the mid
Right.
in the mid and so on.
Yes.
Then in the 80s you have the individualism. You have to be unique, and they managed to sell us
right.
to be unique and so on.
Is this the guy that made smoking cool for women?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose as capitalism became more developed and the amount of production that you had went higher, the types of goods that are worth selling changed a little bit, and the marketing people might have had a big influence on that, right? So I don't know much about what happened, in the 80s era and before that, but in the beginning of the 20th century, there was definitely a move from wanting to buy the thing to wanting to buy experiences. And then from experiences, even experiences became sufficiently available. So from experiences, there was the transition to authenticity. So you no longer want to have the same experience as everyone else, but you want to have the authentic farm-grown coffee from the specific region of God knows where. You're no longer selling
a toaster.
Yeah, before you were selling material, right? Material goods, and then you started selling experiences, and from experiences there was a transition to selling this idea that you are having the authentic experience. The limit, if you push that to the limit, right? If you go to the Manhattan ladies that are so wealthy, they're basically trying to figure out how to signal status now. You actually have artificial neglectedness. So
artificial?
Not artificial neglected, it's artificial scarcity, right? So basically you only make 5 purses of a specific kind, and the value is not in what the purse material is, or even not in the authenticity of it, but in the fact that only 5 people can own it in the world.
Like Elon Musk created only 20,000 flamethrowers.
Oh yeah?
To sell as merchandise. What
Yeah.
comes after authenticity? What's next?
I mean, there's a few things. Musk is actually a very good marketeer of many different kinds of things, right? So he uses counter signaling, for instance, with the Boring Company. Why is it called the Boring Company? Because now we're talking about it, right? It worked. The fact that I'm mentioning it on a podcast means it's good marketing.
Explain counter signaling.
Oh yeah, so signaling theory is a theory in evolutionary psychology where not only evolutionary psychology but also ethology, because animals do it as well. Where you might signal a property by having some other things. So if a female is selecting a male bowerbird, they're not going to select the bowerbird by his individual shape or behavior. They're going to detect if he built a very interesting nest of super colorful things that he picked up in the region nearby, right?
Or the peacock, as an example.
Well, the peacock's tail is a slightly simpler example of signaling, because then the peacock doesn't have any cognitive understanding of what he's signaling, but he just has that.
And the Ferrari in humans.
Yeah, those are costly signals. So both the peacock tail and the Ferrari are costly signaling examples where you're demonstrating that you have so many resources that you can have blue, which is the most expensive color to produce in nature, and colorfulness, and 152 I think is the ideal number of eyes for a peacock to have for maximal attractiveness.
And counter signaling?
So counter signaling is also in birds it was one of the best examples. So if I'm a mama bird and I notice that there's a predator coming nearby, and my child bird is hanging out in the nest, I want to pretend that I'm weak, for instance, right? So this is handicap. You can handicap signal so that you will get the attention of the predator, and then you will fly away but only once the predator is close enough to you that they're no longer paying attention to your kid. So that's a case where the thing that you're signaling and the thing that you are kind of inverse. The same thing with the boring company, right?
Uh-huh.
Like the idea of having a company for flamethrowers, it's not exactly the most boring thing, but you can counter signal that way. Or if you're from a family that has been wealthy for sufficiently long, it's very rare that you will be the owner of a Ferrari or that you will, do things that are stereotypically considered to be wealthy things. So the new rich tend to signal wealth more disproportionately, whereas old family wealth tends to cause people to be more into counter signaling. So they'll be dressed in a more simple manner. They will have behaviors that are not easily necessarily detectable as the high class. Yeah.
So let's return to the question of how did all this knowledge impact your practical day-to-day life?
I mean, I think I can see more easily when there are traps set by society or set by others where people tell me what I should value in a way that I don't think it will actually impact either my life or that which I ethically value in sufficient ways, right? So I think that people are highly concerned and obsessed at times with things that I personally no longer value. And I think part of the reason why I don't value is because I understand the psychological dynamics that are behind it or the biological dynamics that are behind it. And conversely, right, I value more some types of things that I wouldn't know consciously to value otherwise. So I observe landscapes more and I hang out in nature in different ways more because I know that there are detectors in my brain that want to know that there's accessible fruit nearby and that if the enemy was coming from some direction, I could potentially curtail the enemy. And in many other ways, I try to make sure that my limbic system, which is the part of the brain that processes some aspects of emotion, and my nucleus accumbens are experiencing good states. Yeah.
Now I have a really interesting question regarding something which you said. So we know that different tribes clashed to an extent because they hold different values.
Yeah.
They have different criteria: what is good, what is acceptable, what do we want, what do we don't want. That similar thing happened on a large scale with religions, and now similar thing is happening in the last 100 or so years with political ideologies, and
Right.
we get more and more political ideologies, not only political ones, like carnivorism versus veganism, men versus women, and whatever. So we
Right.
get a fragmentation of the number of value systems, so an increase in the number of value systems. My
Right.
question is, can evolutionary psychology lead to the establishment of universal human values which can be used to like synchronize our value systems so that we don't clash so much?
I think there's some difference between my response to that question and what most evolutionary psychology people would say.
Give both.
Yeah, because I think that they would say that yes, you can find sufficiently many universal human universal human traits, many of which summarized by I think David Brown, something like that in 1983, that you could just try to implement a value system that is organized around all those things that are human universals. The way I see it, however, is there are some human groups that are more individualistic, there are some groups that are more tribally affiliated, there are some groups that have transcendental value. So the competition in the world, it isn't easily subsumable into, even if you knew what the origin is, the interest groups are still different, right? So let's take, three of the biggest systems in the world are there's an Eurasian sort of bureaucratic global militarized system that is kind of the remnants of the USSR plus China and other authoritarian systems that want to organize the world in a particular way. Then you have different tribes in the USA that are basically the USA is two worlds. There's a blue tribe and there's a red tribe, and they aim for different things. and the blue tribe of the USA is fairly connected to the global agenda system, the international system that has more to do with nomadic populations that have evolved to be, minorities in different areas, but they're very distributed. And that's one type of value system. So you have the clashing of a system that evolved for social and bureaucratic reasons throughout the last century, another system that evolves through thousands of years for evolutionary reasons, and then you have Islam, which is a very particular religious transcendent system, but it's also extremely powerful in some parts of the world. And these conflicting organizations and ideologies, their constitutive structure isn't made of the same thing, because one is a transcendental religion, one is a bureaucratic population militarized system, one might be a mix of a religious indoctrination and a psychological way of thinking, so Christianity and individualism might be thought of as those things, and then the other is these like nomadic populations and powerful groups in different parts of the world that want to internationalize the world as a whole. So these agents, they're not made of the same thing. These ideas, by the way, I'm getting from Olavo de Carvalho, who is a Brazilian, very, very interesting philosopher, in his debate with Alexander Dugin, who's a Russian intellectual. Russian? Well, Soviet something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what's the next thing which you're going to research? What's the next big question?
I mean, one of the questions that always interested me and fascinated me is what will be the most transformative technological changes in the history of the world, including all the past and all the future, right?
Transhumanism.
And there's a good chance that artificial intelligence might be the one to watch for. Transhumanism might be a bit of a slower transition of transforming human nature into something worth living, let's say. I mean, I do think human nature is pretty awesome, but I also happen to be very high on the distribution of happiness in the spectrum.
Everything is awesome, guys.
So, yeah. I want to make sure that to the extent we can create a technological future where the world has the maximum amount of minds having the best, awesomest time ever, we can do that. And that's basically been my quest. And I think that artificial intelligence is the path that, even though it has a low probability, it has the highest magnitude of interference in the world that you can possibly positively do. So that's what I'm researching, artificial general intelligence.
How can it interfere with the problems with human morality? It would be used as a weapon, 100%. Artificial intelligence. It's too tempting not to do that.
Well, it depends. There's two ways in which artificial intelligence could evolve. One is by, if it's possible for it to bootstrap itself into becoming a superintelligence, then you only need to solve that problem once. And that's the case that I was thinking about when I mentioned that. If you mean like the slow evolution of different artificial intelligence systems in different countries and different companies and so on over time, yeah, then the problem is much more tricky, I suppose, because you have to solve it in every case, and not only you have to solve it in every case, but there's a competitive drive between those different systems and groups. And the ones that don't spend resources in solving that problem might outpace the ones that do. That's the kind of thing that's studied by the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford University. There's a fairly interesting and diverse group of researchers there that's organizing how to think about these competitive drives and evolutionary competition within AI and so on.
I had a slightly different point. Let me elaborate further.
Yeah.
So our modern life, given our modern current technological advance, is better than the life in heaven which was imagined by our ancestors. So modern medicine, for example, even the quality of modern food, clothes, we have magic. So we have more than they could had possibly hoped for. And yet we still had great problems, a great extent of which comes from problems with human morality, like aggression, war, intertribal.
Right. Aggression is not as much of a danger as we would think. Aggression has been getting a very strong bad reputation lately.
Correct.
Mostly because of
it's decreasing dramatically.
There's an interference of of feminism and trying to demasculinize the world. which has suppressed aggression, and aggression in particular in young boys. It's not that damaging. But
Okay.
go on.
Large-scale human conflict. How can
Right.
future technology, including AI, help make the human condition better and awesome? So in order to do that, it
Right.
must also solve the problem of human tribes
Well,
fighting with each other.
Let us first praise the past technology that has already solved most of the game theoretic problems that have been killing humans for God knows how long.
For
Which
example,
is once we had one or two countries that had the ability to destroy the world and each other, you can create this game theoretical constraint that we call mutually assured destruction, and by having mutually assured destruction, you assure that from then on, most wars will be economic and cultural wars instead of being violent and aggressive.
How I stop worrying and stop loving the bomb.
Yes,
or
exactly.
rather, he who presses the button first, he who presses the button first dies second.
Right. So yeah, once that technology was available, that was great.
And I think that we, as humanity, thought a lot about it in the 60s. So we already have some knowledge in it on how technology would affect our lives and using it in warfare. Right?
Yeah, one thing that has been troublesome in technology recently is that, with the development of social media, a new kind of violence that had lain dormant or like partially dormant for most of human history has manifested much more strongly. So male violence was more strong and manifest for most of history. But female violence doesn't manifest as pure power and aggression. It manifests as gossip, behind the back, saying reputational attacks and so on.
Not in a
and
physical
social
way.
media has enabled that to flourish and multiply itself in ways that it had never hitherto done. I actually think that the cause of third wave feminism is the rise of different internet and social media. So, to the extent that third wave feminism is a violent system, I think it was technologically enabled by the creation of these anonymous, instantaneous information transmission systems between people, like in very far directions.
Why aren't you ideologically possessed? High openness? I mean, we're discussing a pretty controversial topics regarding the current times, and yet we can discuss opposite topics and play with those in our minds without getting caught into defending a point for the point's sake. Why are we different from a psychological point of view?
I think a little bit of the training in philosophy might help with that. So I've had training in philosophy, and you learn to entertain different positions, and you learn to articulate a position that you don't necessarily believe. And also having been influenced by Less Wrong, which is a rationality blog, and a group of people who are constantly trying to figure out the truth, even when they're wrong, helps. But just having some emotional stability and some emotional centering that doesn't depend on these identity groups, that's very helpful to me, right? So what I most like to get out of a discussion is that some mind changes, but I don't mind if the mind that changes is mine. Whereas most people try to get out of a discussion that the other mind changes, and that's almost always you always want to seek the information that would demonstrate that you're wrong, and most people just don't have the psychological fortitude to anticipate that that's what they want to do. Also, conformism actually pays off, right? So if you're a conformist, you're more likely to find a mate. In most of the natural group systems that humans had throughout evolutionary history. So it makes sense that most people should be conformists, and that only if you've taken a big status hit or something like that you would be willing to explore unusual, controversial, weird ideas that diverge from your immediate group. But now that everyone is connected, like basically no one knows what to do, and half the people are getting completely ideologically possessed in one direction, and half the people are getting the other way.
And they want to destroy each other, with all means possible.
Yeah, I mean, to be frank, it's not as bad as it used to be in the Cold War, right? They were still trying to do that back then.
You said that you were attacked for your ideas. physically?
I think I know I've been attacked most likely socially or from a group perspective. So sometimes someone might try to uh, either lie or distort something that I've said to people that are getting to know me in order to preemptively have them think of me with such like a negative reputation that they don't want to interface
some
with me.
sort of a predisposition, like some sort of a prejudice, like before they actually get to know you, they're
Yeah.
getting to know you through the other person's words.
Right, and yeah, basically it's just a
Happens
system of
everywhere.
there's a system of gossip and attack, and this is a system like this is a system that's very operant in the left in general. Like the current left as of 20 years ago or so, but a little bit before that, it attacks the individual instead of attacking the idea. It attacks by reputational cost or by removing the source of income more often than it attacks by specifically trying to say, look, here's where the hole in your argument is, and here's why you're wrong, right?
Can teaching basic critical thinking at
No, because you're
help?
you're assuming that the
The
even though
individual has
the
the capacity to be taught to think critically, and some people.
yeah, like these people might have the capacity to think critically, but it's not necessarily in their best political interest to do so. So Saul Alinsky, for instance, was one of the developers of. I think he wrote a book called Rules for Revolutionaries or something
What
like
for
that.
revolutionaries?
Rules for Revolutionaries or some other thing. I don't remember the name of it. But the basic idea is he suggested this idea of methodological nihilism, which is as long as it causes you to get power in the end, as long as it causes the party or the system that you're fighting for to get power in the end, it doesn't matter by which methodology you play the game. So to some extent, this has generated a system where, to the extent that the left and the right are sort of playing tennis to each other, the right is playing with the net on, and the left just puts the net down and then plays, right? So they're willing to do whatever it takes in order to acquire the amount of power that's needed for achieving whatever political goals. So you see that in the United States recently, and they really needed to get this guy out of the judicial system, and they were willing to use a woman who didn't want to speak in public and delay the information that she gave to them in order to maximize the probability that that guy wouldn't end up in the Supreme Court. It's not because they didn't care about the woman and they didn't have an ethical rule that would prevent them from doing so, because the goal was to. I mean, there were many goals, right? But the main goal was just to increase the amount of power that the left and the blue tribe has in the Supreme Court of the U.S.
And maybe to some extent, this behavior is unconsciously motivated and they are rationalized.
Well, in the majority of people, for sure. In fact, it's people are not that hard to herd, to be a shepherd of, if you know how to poke their buttons, right? So,
With a stick.
yeah, and this happens in the right and the left. This is not a like Trump might be more right wing now, but he's an extremely excellent and powerful manipulator of people. Obama was a very amazing speaker who could transform the intuitions of crowds in minutes. And you also have deeper political agents who are doing that kind of thing from an economic or intellectual perspective. So you might have the academic equivalents of these famous politicians, right, who are doing that by other ways, or even investors that are just switching and poking the economy in ways that might cause the same effects. Right.
If you want to lead, you have to be an agile person. So you don't have to stick to some decision or some kind of mentality. You can change it just to be in charge, something like that.
High in openness.
Yeah.
Yeah, being high in openness definitely helps.
What can raise openness except psychedelics?
I don't think we know anything except psychedelics that can raise. In fact, personality characteristics are fairly stable across a lifetime, with the exception of openness when you take psychedelics.
Yeah, openness has some practical advantages in evolutionary terms. It's an adaptation to a certain environment, right?
Sure. Well, the reason why the big five personality characteristics or big 10 personality aspects are personality characteristics to begin with is because it's evolutionarily valuable to be within the entire range of the distribution. If it wasn't valuable to be in the distribution, there would be just, let's say, defects, right? There would be just problems that you have. But it's not a problem to be highly neurotic, because even though it might cause a lot of trouble in your social life, it will make you very good at taking care of a baby that's a very innocent and tiny thing that,
Or living in a dangerous environment that rapidly changes.
Right, or living in an environment where you're not supposed to be trusting people, or you're supposed to be switching gears very quickly and efficiently.
In what environment did people who score high in openness evolve in?
No, but the population as a whole will get a different distribution of personalities, perhaps, but you definitely want to have at least a tiny bit of all personalities in most societies, right?
Or rather, the question was, high openness is beneficial in what situations?
Well, when you have abundance of resources, you might want to test new territories, right? So you want to have high openness on that. If you think of the fitness landscape as being, a series of valleys and mountains, then when you are stuck in a local good, you want to have someone who is high in openness enough to find whichever way you can basically jump and find the globally maximally valuable resource. So high openness is one way to get that sort of thing. And increased plasticity in general might do that. So the two plasticity related characteristics are openness and extroversion. If you're high in extroversion or if you're high in openness, in both cases you're more likely to stumble into the solution that no one else has used for the last 1,000 years.
I mean, I think when we play RPGs, computer games, a team of 5 people selects 5 different characters, which have different abilities and skills, and they work together in order to win. And when I view human psychological traits, it's something like that. You're good in something, someone else is good at something else, and when we work together, we can achieve much more this way. And yet, this is also a source of identity which people use in order to distinguish themselves from other people and fight again.
There's a motivational speaker in the US. What's his name? Tony Robbins, yeah. So Tony Robbins mentions that all humans have 6 needs. I'm not going to remember all of them, but the 2 ones that are relevant for the issue I'll remember, which is everyone has a need for certainty and a need for uncertainty. And those might seemingly be inconsistent needs, but at least it seemed in his experience meeting people from many different societies and systems that everyone wants to be sufficiently certain of their external environment that they can act in ways that cause predictive movements, but also you want to have sufficient levels of uncertainty that you don't get too bored, or you have some system that activates you.
So you're on the border between chaos and order, like Jordan Peterson.
If you want to translate that into Petersonian vocabulary, then for sure, yes.
In the old futuristic novellas where the humankind achieve all the well-being, a lot of time they are bored and need some uncertainty in their life. When something happens, so this uncertainty is...
And this is an evolutionarily designed... Yeah, the loss of valence is an evolutionarily designed drive, right? You want for your environment to change, especially if it's no longer the case that you're increasing your ability to produce babies in the future, or great-grandchildren or whatever.
And when we talk about uncertainty, we can't go without mentioning Nassim Taleb and fooled by
randomness.
I'm not very familiar with that aspect of Taleb's work. I only know about anti-fragility, which is one of the concepts that he came up with. And the black swan, sure.
Yeah. anti-fragility is the result of his previous work on how we understand, more like how we don't understand uncertainty and randomness.
Right. Yeah, we're not necessarily very good at inferring these mathematical complex constructs that are created later.
Yeah, but in psychology terms, it's like in our everyday life, we take a lot of decisions and they're not exactly rational, and we take them because we think they are rational and that they are about we're going to achieve certain outcome with certainty, but actually it's quite the opposite. That's why bubbles are happening, like economically, and
Right.
even with Bitcoin and something like that. Most people are certain that it's going to rise, but the causality is lacking. Like, why it should happen?
Right. I think we definitely have economic systems that are not, organized in the same ways as the mystical environment in which we evolved. We evolved to deal with nature, spirits, animals, and other humans. And then suddenly we find ourselves in a world of algorithms, blockchains, and speculators, and
The new beasts.
and global internet. It's definitely a big mismatch between our environment of adaptation and our current world.
Yeah.
I think it's time for one last question.
Yeah.
I imagine that, so I read a lot of science fiction as young, and I still read some, and I always imagined a future human space civilization. So the question is, okay, we can send people to Mars, but what should we do? Some random ideas of yours to prevent us into starting an ideological fight on Mars. Imagine that, the pro-dust versus the anti-Martian dust people, fight, The dust is natural, we shouldn't interfere.
Well, I guess in that particular case, evolutionary psychology is sort of on our side, right? Because when scarcity kicks in, we sort of know what to do. We default to hierarchies of competence with very efficient and accurate and fast. We do those things fairly fast because I mean it's really easy to get humans to elect and organize around the leader by noticing a meteor or a volcano or something like that, right?
Those movies,
quick, It's a fairly quick system that will happen there. And these ideological battles that you see, they're in great part, because different people evolved in different systems, different countries have different interests, and so on. And you're not going to get that in a small society for a really, really long time. So, for instance, it wasn't necessary to evolve a monotheistic god until societies were about, a few million people wide. And likewise, for as long as the Mars population is small, I wouldn't predict there to be some sort of ideological clashes between them, because small societies can solve conflicts by far more amenable and biologically natural ways than the hyper-complex legal systems that we've evolved now, the political chaos that we've evolved now, memes through the internet, and if you're not even at the stage at which you need a religion and a god in order to organize a society, that is, if you have a small tribe, you're not going to get ideological conflict anytime soon. That's my guess.
Okay.
Let's just say we're good at surviving.
We're very good at surviving in small groups.
Okay, punchline. Nice for it. So thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you for coming to Varna. So we chatted once or twice, and you decided to come here, and it was a great pleasure. Really, sincerely.
It was a pleasure to be here, and thank you guys for an interesting discussion.
Okay, music and credits rolling. Okay, bye.